Okay, we are now live.
Well, welcome to Water Quality Wednesday. We're going to give it about another minute or two, let more folks join, and thank you so much for being here. Hello, and welcome to Water Quality Wednesday. My name is Angela DePalma Dow, and I just want to do an audio check. I want to make sure that on your screen, you see our flyer for our Water Quality Wednesday for January 12th, 2022, and that also that you can hear me talking. So if you can't hear or you can't see, click on your chat button and let us know. And then we'll get started right here in a few seconds. All right, so welcome to Water Quality Wednesday. Once again, my name is Angela DePalma Dow. I am from Lake County's Water Resource Department. I am also Lady of the Lake, a column in the Lake County News. And we're gonna do little introductions. I just did myself. We also have on our tech staff today from County of Lake Admin, we have Sam Houston, which is helping us get this on PEG TV and our County of Lake Facebook page. And then we also have Jake Rickey, which is our tech, and he's helping us with all Zoom technology. Thank you so much, you guys. So some reminders for the attendees today. We will have some question and answer between both of the speakers tonight. So you can save your questions for those times. You can also put your questions in the chat box at the bottom, and I will make sure and get to those tonight. This meeting will be recorded, and it will be posted on our County of Lake Water Resources website. We will also have it on the County of Lake Facebook page for future viewing. We'll also have it on our YouTube on the channel for Lake County Water Resources. And you can always follow us on Facebook at Lake County Water if you aren't already. And at the end of the talk and the chat, I will be posting a evaluation for us, a little link that you can go to, answer like 6 questions. It'll take 30 seconds just so we can see how we're doing with Water Quality Wednesday. So Water Quality Wednesdays, briefly, this is the second event in this series. And this is our way of having open, accessible forums so we can share information. And we really want to help demystify lake and water science, particularly here with Clear Lake and all of the other aquatic resources we have in Lake County. So we want to learn about the people, places, programs, and projects that are going on right here in our Lake County backyard. And knowing that we all play a part in protecting these valuable aquatic systems, having the information that's out there, most current, all the scientific, technical, and agency information available is one way that we can do that. And so we're hoping Water Quality Wednesday forums help facilitate some of that information sharing. And I want to start off this meeting today with an acknowledgement for the caretakers that were here before us, the original Clear Lake and Hitch caretakers of the Pomo. So you might have heard of Lupioma, that's the creation story of Mount Canacti. But we also have a name for Clear Lake, or Big Water in Native Pomo, sometimes pronounced as Kabatin or Hokasa. So just really want to acknowledge those that came before us that took care of this land for many, many years. So into our first speaker here is Fred Feyrer, and he's a research fish biologist at USGS, and he works at the California Water Science Center. It's located in Sacramento. I believe it's at Sac State. That's my alumni. And he's published multiple papers on Clear Lake Hitch and Clear Lake and around the whole Sacramento region. And Fred's just a wealth of information. And we're so lucky today that he's going to be here and share with us a little bit about Hitch. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll let Fred take it over. If you're ready to go, Fred. There he is. Good to see you.
Great. Hey, thank you for that, Angela. And can you see my screen okay?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, I got to hit the button.
So close. Ah, there we go.
Great. Thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here with you all this evening and share with you a lot of the research we've been doing recently on the Clear Lake Hitch. So as Angela mentioned, my name is Fred Feyrer. I'm a research fish biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and our headquarters is on the Sacramento State campus. Happy to share with you today, this evening, the work we've been doing on Clear Lake Hitch ecology over the last few years. So the first thing I need to do is get a disclaimer out of the way. A few slides into my presentation, I have some data that I'll be sharing with you all that's not officially published and publicly available yet. So my agency wanted to have this disclaimer put up that those data are considered preliminary and subject to revision. Take that with you will. The data are solid, they just haven't been fully published and made available yet. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in. So the Clear Lake Hitch is it's a minnow species. So a lot of people think of minnows as being small fish. Minnows a lot of times are very small fish, but there actually is a group of fish taxonomically called minnows, or the family Cyprinidae, and the Clear Lake Hitch is one of them. And we have about 17 native minnows to California. There's really 15 presently. There's 2 that are extinct here on this slide. There's the Clear Lake splittail, and then there's also a thick-tailed chub that unfortunately are no longer with us. But there is the Clear Lake Hitch, which is, it is a minnow species. And there are actually 3 different unique genetically distinct population segments of the Clear Lake Hitch. So you may have heard that there are possibly hitch in other places in California, maybe the Delta or in other areas, and that's true, that's the case. So this is a map here showing the broader distribution in California of hitch in general. And they occur pretty broadly throughout the central portion of California. And there are, as I mentioned, there's 3 distinct subpopulations of this particular fish. The one that we're obviously interested in here is the Clear Lake Hitch. So it was formerly considered to be a unique kind of subspecies, but it's been more recently kind of designated as a distinct population segment. And it's outlined here in what is actually this pink color here. And you're all probably pretty generally familiar with the fish. It is, in terms of its present status, it was listed in 2014 as a threatened species under the California Endangered Species Act. And Amber Aquilera from the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's going to be speaking right after me, will talk a little bit about the status of the fish on the federal side under the Federal Endangered Species Act and the conservation efforts moving forward there. But this is also a fish that has, just really immeasurable cultural value and ecological value to the lake and to the people around the lake. So it's a very important species, scientifically, ecologically, and just in general all around. It's a really fascinating fish. So this is a fish that has a really interesting life history and a really complex life cycle. So for a minnow species, again, people generally think of minnows as small fish. This is a relatively large fish for a minnow. It gets up to about 14 to 16 inches in length when they're full grown. And they generally live about 6 to 7 years old. So if you see a really big hitch out in the water in the streams and it looks like it's, about 14, 15, 16 inches long, it's probably about 5, 6, 7 years of age. So they're pretty relatively long-lived. And they're opportunistic in the sense that they will take advantage of the habitats and the food resources that are available to them. So they live pretty broadly in the lake, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. When they're little babies living in the streams, what they'll do is they'll feed on small aquatic insects and invertebrates. When the fish move into the lake, they'll feed predominantly on zooplankton, primarily water fleas like cladocerans and those kinds of things. And they're highly migratory. They move a lot. These are really active fish. So these fish not only move a lot within the lake, they're pretty much constantly on the move. They also, as you probably know, they migrate up into the tributaries of the lake for spawning, and they do this in the springtime. And it's a really great thing. I kind of think of it as analogous to salmon in the ocean, where the lake is kind of the ocean for the hitch, and these streams are very similar, at least in terms of function, for the hitch in terms of their reproduction. So a little bit more about their life cycle. So in the top circle here, generally at the onset of spring, late winter, the adult fish in the lake will start kind of congregating near the mouths of these tributary streams when they're wet. And when the timing is right, when the temperatures are right, and the conditions are favorable, these fish will move up into the streams, and that's where they will do their spawning. And a lot of you have probably seen them spawning in the streams. It's really a pretty spectacular sight. Those fish will reproduce. They'll hold the streams for a little while. The adults will move back down to the lake, and the juveniles seem to kind of hold out in the streams as long as they're inundated for a period of time. Once the water starts to recede, then those fish will move. These juveniles will move back out of the streams into the lake, where then they will live predominantly kind of near shore for the first year or so of their lives. And then they'll, as they grow up into adulthood, that's when they'll kind of expand their habitat and their range and move to kind of offshore areas and start roaming the lake in general. So pretty fascinating life history. And we know from a lot of studies that we've been doing, both on the fish themselves and through these observational programs, such as the Chi Council's spawning surveys, these fish use a broad array of the streams that feed into the lake for spawning. One of the real benefits of these fish in studying them is that they really have their own internal flight recorder, in the sense that you've probably heard of fish ear bones before. They're odorless. What we can do is we can look at the chemical composition of these otoliths, and they form these rings, these bands, very similar to the way trees do. So you can age these fish by counting these rings, and you can examine the chemical composition in these rings and find out where on the landscape these fish have been living. So it's kind of this CSI where we can find out where these fish have been living and what they've been doing all their lives. And so we've been able to do this and examine the otoliths of these fish and find out that they've been using a broad array of streams for spawning and rearing. And then you can see where this chemical signature kind of converges all together when they finally reach the lake. And so we're able to reconstruct the life histories of these fish, and that tells us a lot about when and where these fish have been born, which streams and which areas are suitable for spawning and reproduction. It's really important information that we're able to utilize for both science and conservation of the fish. Now, by all accounts, this fish has been really highly abundant historically. I like to share this slide here and this quote in the presentations I give, because you often hear, just in general, you hear stories from old timers talking about, oh, there used to be so many fish in the creeks, we could walk across the backs of these fish. Well, there was a scientist back in the 1920s who actually wrote such a thing in a scientific paper. So there was allegedly so many Clear Lake Hitch in these streams that this gentleman, Mr. Coleman, studied back in the late 1920s that he wrote in a paper that he published in 1930 that there was they are then so abundant that one can hardly step without stepping on several. So I think that's a pretty neat little anecdote that speaks to the anecdotal knowledge of how many fish there really used to be in this system. And one of the challenges we've had with managing this fish is that by all accounts, abundance has dropped dramatically compared to historic times, but we don't really have a strong sense of what those numbers really are. It's really difficult, bordering on impossible, to get a true population estimate size of these fish in the lake. So what we've been doing is some work in the lake to try to generate kind of indices of population abundance. And we've been doing that since 2017 is when we started. And so what we do is we go out in the lake in the early summertime and we try to sample these fish and collect them using these nets here that you can see in this slide. And we're typically out on the lake in really anytime during June. We've occasionally been out in early July, but typically in June. You may have seen us out on these boats deploying our nets out there trying to catch these fish. And this map here just kind of shows you from the first year or two of work, kind of, the distribution of our samples in the lake and the fish that we've been collecting and the types of nets that we've been using. And it's been a pretty effective tool to capture these fish. As you can imagine, it's a big lake and the fish are really hard to catch because they're pretty broadly distributed and they occupy the open water habitats of the lake. And so they can be pretty hard to find. So it takes quite a bit of effort for us to actually collect this information and get this valuable population information on these fish. One of the things that we learned first off the bat is that these fish like to live where they can breathe. So you're probably familiar with the fact that the lake has dissolved oxygen problems from time to time, especially down near the bottom where you can't always see it as a citizen. But with our instruments, we can definitely measure it. But what we found out right away is that in areas of what we call hypoxia, areas with really low dissolved oxygen concentration, these fish just typically avoid these areas. And so in periods of time when there's a large area or volume of the lake that has these conditions, it really constricts the available habitat volume for the Clear Lake Hitch. And not just Clear Lake Hitch, but all the other fishes that live in the lake as well. And this is a slide here just showing you a few examples of when we first started our work of the distribution of the dissolved oxygen concentrations in the lake, both on the surface and the bottom in 2017 and 2018. And here what I'm showing you on the left here is just a plot of the numbers of fish that we've caught over the years in good, healthy, normoxic water compared to the hypoxic water. And obviously, just like you and I, the fish only like to live where they can actually breathe and where the habitat's suitable. So in terms of what we've seen with the patterns in abundance with the fish over the years. So again, we started this work in 2017, and we just completed our most recent survey in 2021. Unfortunately, we missed 2020 because of some COVID issues, but we've got a pretty good, we're building a pretty solid data set so far. And this is, getting back to that disclaimer, this is the slide here where just keep in mind that the 2021 data have not been officially published and made publicly available yet. All the other data, everything else that I've shared with you is all publicly available on websites. I have a link at the end where you can get the information or the research papers that we've written on this stuff. And probably within the month is when this 2021 data will be available for everyone to look at themselves too. What I'm showing you here in this plot is obviously on the x-axis here are the years we've been doing the work. And on the vertical, or this y-axis here, are the abundances of the fish in those years. And so these bars here represent the average number of fish that we've collected per net set. So each time we deploy our nets and retrieve them, that's how many fish we get back. And then the numbers in the bars here are the total numbers of fish that we've caught in those years. And one thing I'll say is that the distribution and the capture kind of distribution of these fish is very patchy. So they're schooling fish, so we'll go many net sets without catching a fish, and then we'll get a few net sets with a whole bunch of fish. And so it averages out to a relatively low number, but we can use those data and do fancy statistical things with them and generate plots like this that kind of show us, how many fish are in the lake relative across years. And so you can see the first 2 years we did this work, the numbers were, well, at least respect to the whole time series, relatively high, right? And then we saw this pretty dramatic drop in abundance that we first observed in 2019 and then continued on in 2021. And so that definitely caught our attention. And what we've learned is that this crash in abundance seems to be linked to a failure of recruitment of the juvenile fish into the population. And so what I'm showing you here, again, this, just make note of this disclaimer here for the 2021 data. So on this horizontal axis is length of fish, and this is in millimeters. And so the way this breaks down is across this dotted line here, all the fish that line up to the left that are, roughly from about 50 to 200 millimeters, those are all juvenile fish. And then once the fish reaches about 200 millimeters in length is when they become reproductively mature adults. And so these, everything you see on the right of that dash line are adult fish. And then on the vertical axis of each one of these year plots here is just the number of individuals for that particular length category. And what you can see here is that in this first year we had, at the time, what we thought was a relatively healthy looking population in terms of a lot of juvenile fish and fewer adult fish. You would expect there to be fewer adult fish as you increase in age because just of natural mortality. There's a lot more juveniles in the population than there would be adults. And then that changed dramatically in 2018, where we saw very few juveniles, and these juveniles from 2017 were showing up as adults in 2018, as they should. So things were making sense with the data, but we were alarmed with this lack of juveniles that we saw in 2018. And what's turning out to be the case is that these juveniles are almost completely disappearing, to the point of they did completely disappear from our surveys in 2021. And this is a bit concerning to a lot of us who work on this fish. It's potentially a really big problem because obviously you need juvenile fish recruiting into your population in order to sustain it moving forward. And the big issue with this is that this has been going on for a number of years now, unfortunately. So this started in 2017 because these individuals here in the 2008 plot are fish that were born in 2017. And so that is the first year where this recruitment failure seems to have started. And it's persisted all the way until this last year. So it's been going on a good 4 or 5 years or so. And the problem with that is, the alarming piece of that is, if you think of it in terms of, like, say, a human population, this fish lives 6, 7, 8 years old. We've had a 4 or 5 year recruitment failure. you know, imagine a human population where there's no babies born into the population for 40 or 50 years. Not a very good thing for your fish population. So this is something we're all concerned about. We're going to be looking into this a little bit more carefully to try to uncover what processes might be causing this juvenile recruitment failure. We don't know the causes beyond what we can speculate about. But what we do know is that it occurs at some point between the adult spawning stage and when the juveniles at 1 year of age recruit to our survey. So that's the status of the population as it is right now. So given that relatively not so good news, it's going to be really important for us as a community to keep an eye out for these fish, to be super vigilant and keep an eye out for when we see these fish out in the streams, especially when they're spawning in the springtime. So I'd highly encourage all of you to actively participate in these spawning surveys that the Chi Council organizes and to contribute your observations to their database. Those are going to be critically important moving forward so that we can keep tabs on how well this population is going to be doing. So please consider that. Before I end, I just want to go ahead and acknowledge the great support we've received at USGS from both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've supported this work both in a variety of ways, including funding this work. So we've been able to generate this information to help identify the status and trends of this fish species. So with that, this is my last slide here. It's got a lot of the information on it that I covered during my talk. I understand this is going to be recorded, so you guys will be able to go back to this. You can grab a quick screen grab, print it out, or you can reach me by email. I'll be happy to share this presentation or any of this information with you all. And with that, Angela, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Fred. Great talk. Appreciate you being here and sharing that information with us. So we do have a question in the chat, but I just want to make sure everybody else, if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand in the Zoom room, and then, or you can put your question down in the chat. We'll get to that. Lori is asking, and she looks like she's from Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is a WEHA, is asking if she can contact you for information about the abundance. So because your numbers, your graphs weren't able to be distributed, is there a way that people can get that information? And I will have Fred's contact at the end of this presentation. I'll have both Amber and Fred's contact so you guys can get that too.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So I'm switching screens here. Any other questions? Looks like we do have one raised hand. And Greg, I'll go ahead and give you access. You can go ahead and talk right now.
Great, thank you. This is really interesting. Thank you for putting this on. Fred, any idea as to why the reduction in juvenile population?
Yeah, so kind of broke up a little bit there. I think the question was whether or not we have any thoughts on what's causing the crash in the juvenile population. So we have some ideas. They're nothing really more than ideas at this moment because we don't have the information to be able to test those ideas. So, you know, it could range from spawning failure of adults to poor survival of juveniles either in the stream to reach the lake or of the juveniles when they enter the lake. So those are probably the most likely life stages. Well, those are the life stages where the process is taking place. We don't have any information on the abundances of these fish at that life stage in these different habitats to kind of lead us in any one direction. But that's something we're hoping to tease apart a little bit moving forward.
Thanks for that question, Greg. Thanks for responding, Fred. And then we have one more question, and we'll go on to the next speaker here. And so this is from Betsy Kahn. And she's asking if you've been in contact with tribal EPA groups who produced a hitch management plan many years ago. And I will say that I think Amber might touch on this too in her next talk. So if you want to respond to that, but I think it'll be covered in the next talk as well.
Sure, yeah, I can just speak real briefly to that. So briefly, the answer is yes. So we coordinate and keep in touch quite a bit with all the tribes around the lake. We've shared this work with them ever since the beginning. And as Angela alluded to, Amber's going to talk a little bit about how the tribes have been actively involved in the development of the conservation strategy moving forward.
Great, thanks for that. And actually, we're ahead. I have 1 more minute for the next talk, so I'll put in one more question here. So quick. Sarah's asking if otolith studies contributed to understanding of the recruitment issues at all, or maybe a follow-up from me is there any way to use that technology as we go forward and try to figure out what's going on?
Sure. Yeah. So the otoliths they're really amazing little structures. So they're actually they're used really often and frequently in similar studies for salmon. So if you catch a salmon out in the ocean, you can process it the right way in the lab and find out exactly which river your salmon was born in and when it entered the ocean and all that kind of good stuff. But we could do the same things with Clear Lake Hitch. And so where this tool is going to be really helpful is moving forward and trying to understand the drivers of this recruitment issue. So what we'll be able to do is look at the otoliths of these fish to find out which streams are producing successful reproduction and contributing to the population. That'll help us identify where we need to potentially implement restoration actions and things like that.
Thank you for that. And I do have one more question. We have a couple more in the chat, but I'm going to save them to the end because they might get answered in the next talk. But really quickly from Eduardo is, what creek depth do fish require for spawning and migrating? And then we'll go on to Amber here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't necessarily have any hard numbers on that because the fish are pretty amazing in that they can find a way. So, they have been successful in spawning in the tributaries over a really broad range of conditions. And I'm sure you guys are all just as aware as I am of, how dramatically the water levels and the flows in these creeks can vary, not just over a season, but even over the matter of weeks and days. And so the fish will utilize these habitats to the best extent that they can, and they're able to, navigate obstacles and get upstream. And so the simplest answer I can give you is they will, again, being an opportunistic species, they'll utilize whatever they can get. They generally like kind of gravelly type of substrate, not unlike what you might expect a salmon to spawn on. They don't build nests. They're what you call a broadcast spawner. What they'll do is they'll group up into, like several males will group up with a female, and they'll do these spawning rushes, and the female will release her eggs and the males will release, their sperm at the same time as they're moving through the stream. And so they'll utilize a pretty wide variety of conditions.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. Really appreciate it. And stick around. At the end, we'll have a few more minutes for questions and answer session. So we'll go on now to Amber. Amber is our second speaker tonight for our Water Quality Wednesday, all about hitch. Amber Aquilera is a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she works out of the Sacramento office. And she's been coordinating the hitch conservation strategy, which Fred had mentioned in his talk. And I've been on several meetings with Amber. She's doing a great job trying to wrangle different agencies and knowledge and put it all together. And as Fred mentioned, there's lots of gaps, of knowledge gaps, but we still have to make a conservation strategy. So how do you address things where you don't have a lot of information? So you have a big task in front of you, and you've been doing great. And so we're so glad today to hear about that. And I will let you have it. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. Oh, it's telling me. Oh,
there you go.
There we go.
I have to
Let's see if I can do this right now. All right. Is everyone seeing my screen there?
Yeah, we see your notes too. So
Oh,
if you want to either switch.
Oh no, it worked earlier. Let's try this again. Oh, because it's that one. Did that work?
Yes,
Okay,
that
see
looks
the slides
great.
now. Okay,
Good
perfect.
job.
So like Angela mentioned, my name is Amber Aguilera, and I'm a listing and recovery biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service out of our Sacramento field office. I'm here today to talk about the Clear Lake Hitch conservation strategy that currently is in development. I did want to touch on one thing though. Fred mentioned earlier that the Clear Lake Hitch is listed under the California Endangered Species Act. However, it is not listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We made a not warranted determination at the end of 2020, I believe. I should caveat that with, though, we have been sued over that determination, and we currently are in litigation. So it's not currently listed federally, but we are in litigation. Let's see if it wants to switch slides for me. There we go. So I just quickly wanted to touch on the species life history using this life history diagram. I know Fred went into this in a little bit more detail, but it does have some implications on some of the actions that we created for the strategy. So I just wanted to go over it really quick again. So the Clear Lake Hitch use different portions of the watershed depending on their life history stage. Adults spend most of their time in the open water of the lake, and when it's time to spawn, they make their way up the tributary streams to reproduce, and then they migrate back into the lake. The eggs and embryos develop within the streams, and once they grow into fry, they begin to make their way into the nearshore portions of the lake. Juveniles rear along the lake's nearshore habitat and move into the open water of the lake once they transition into adults. We also know some adults are spawning within the lake, but we don't know to what extent, and we do believe that stream spawning is the primary reproductive strategy for the hitch. So there are several habitat factors that the hitch requires to complete its life history. Connectivity is required throughout the watershed, especially between tributary streams and the lake, to allow for successful reproduction. There also needs to be enough flow within the tributary streams to allow the adults to reach spawning habitat to reproduce and for early life history development. There also needs to be enough water retained within those tributaries to allow the adults to make their way back into the lake and to allow the young to migrate from the streams into that nearshore habitat. Another requirement is wetland or tule habitat surrounding the lake for the young to rear, to provide protection from predators, and ultimately for successful recruitment into the reproductive population. The hitch also needs clean, well-oxygenated water within the lake and also likely within the tributaries for survival. Now, we know many of these factors have been impacted throughout the watershed, so really what we're trying to get at with the conservation strategy is how do we improve the species habitat so we can increase reproductive success, recruitment, and survival? So the purpose of the strategy is to address the issues that are having an impact on the watershed and the hitch. The thought is if we can improve conditions in the watershed, we can improve the conditions for the hitch and vice versa. The approach for the strategy was to identify goals, objectives, and actions needed to improve the species and its habitat. Goals are more general categories of what we want to achieve, such as increased reproduction or increased survival, whereas objectives are more specific and tier from each goal. Individual actions are then identified to meet each one of those objectives, and some actions have already been planned, are currently developed, are being implemented, or even use information from past projects that have been implemented. So first, I want to recognize the many conservation strategy contributors that we have. And to be a contributor, you could be a signatory to the conservation strategy. You could be contributing research, funding sources, interested parties, habitat, or even species managers. And here I have a wide selection of all the folks that have been working on the strategy with us. We have numerous local tribes, numerous local agencies and groups, state agencies, federal agencies, and quite a few consultants as well. So I'm going to start diving in and getting into all the goals, objectives, and actions in the strategy. So goal 1 is to provide for increased reproduction and survival. And objective 1.1 is to have a population target for the species. Our first action, which is 1.1.1, is to set that population target. And our current target is 3-pronged and relies on ongoing California Department of Fish and Wildlife survey data. This population target is adaptable as we learn more information, especially about the ecology and demographics of the species. Still under Goal 1 in that same objective, we have actions 1.1.2 and 1.1.3, which are to continue the ongoing surveys to determine population size and whether we are meeting that target. So as Fred talked about earlier, the USGS has been monitoring the lake using gillnet surveys, and CDFW has been doing electrofishing in the near shore habitat. And so that is our action 1.1.2. We also have visual spawning surveys that are currently being completed, there we go, by the local tribes and also by CDFW. So under that same goal and objective, we have action 1.1.4, which is to verify the permanent removal of barriers in the watershed. And really for this specific action, the team was specifically indicating the primary spawning creeks within the watershed, as that would give the species the greatest opportunity for successful reproduction when there's enough water in the creeks. Still under Goal 1, but under Objective 1.2, is to increase the survival of juvenile hitch. The focus of the actions under this objective is to restore wetland habitat and advocate for planned projects. For the hitch, wetland habitat provides for increased protection from predators, increased prey abundance, and improved water quality. And that would benefit both adult and juvenile hitch by increasing juvenile survival and the likelihood for improvement. Action 1.2.1 is to advocate for the Middle Creek Project, which is a project that is primarily being led by the Army Corps of Engineers and Lake County, but includes other partners as well. The next action is to assist in the restoration of Tule Lake, which is a project that's currently being led by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. Action 1.2.3 is to assist in the restoration of the mouth of Manning Creek, which is being led by the Lake County Trust. And we actually have a fourth action under this objective, which I didn't include on this slide, which is to restore wetland habitat at the mouth of other tributaries. And this is a more general action and isn't specific to any one tributary in the watershed. So also under Goal 1 is Objective 1.3, which is to identify and address migration barriers throughout the watershed. And barriers have been a priority for the team since the presence of barriers throughout the watershed currently limit reproduction even when there is enough water within the tributary streams. So action 1.3.1 is a watershed-wide assessment of barriers under different flow conditions. And action 1.3.2 is to develop passage criteria for hitch. And we already have actually some initial draft criteria as we continue to learn from barrier projects that have already been implemented. And some of those projects are detailed here. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife installed a ramp on Manning Creek in 2020. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of water last year, and so it really couldn't be tested, but we're really hoping for a good year this year so it can be tested this next season. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife also modified the Kelsey Creek, this is always a tongue tie for me, Kelsey Creek Detention Structure Fish Ladder in 2017. And prior to that modification, the hitch was only able to use one ladder through that detention structure, and now they have two available. Another project that California Department of Fish and Wildlife worked on with Caltrans was a barrier on Coal Creek, and they were able to address that by solidifying a culvert foundation and adding a fish ladder. And currently in the planning stages is to address the barrier at the Kelsey Creek Main Street Bridge. This project is a multi-tribal effort with Flow West Consulting and in cooperation with Lake County. And hitch are currently limited to reaches below this barrier, and the project is estimated to open up to 8 miles of additional spawning habitat on that creek. So Goal 2 is to provide suitable habitat conditions in tributaries. Objectives 2.1 through 2.4 under this goal are to restore the tributary creeks. Actions 2.1.1 through 2.3.1 are to specifically restore Kelsey's, Scott's, and Middle Creeks respectively, using already available assessments and literature. I've just put the 3 assessments that we have that are already out there up on the slide. Also included under these actions are to update the available assessments if needed. Action 2.4.1 is to assess other tributaries. And again, this is just a general action and is not specific to any one creek within the watershed. It's just any of the tributaries within the watershed. Objective 2.5 and Action 2.5.1 is to develop tributary restoration guidance. And this guidance will help guide priority projects or actions, aid in permitting, and provide consistency across restoration efforts throughout the watershed. The last objective, Objective 2.6, and action under this goal is to finalize the design and implement the Adobe Creek Conjunctive Use Project. This project would increase the amount of flow within Adobe Creek during the spring, which would benefit Hitch and also replace depleted groundwater. Goal 3 of the strategy is to provide suitable habitat conditions within Clear Lake. And Objective 3.1 has 2 actions that focus primarily just on existing wetlands. Action 3.1.1 is the restoration of wetlands on public land and outreach to private landowners. And the second action is to acquire and protect existing wetland habitat. Objective 3.2 focuses on historical wetlands. And the first action under that objective is to identify parcels that once supported wetland habitat and that also have the potential for restoration. And then the second action under that is to acquire, protect, and then restore those parcels. Goal 4 is to continue and expand research and monitoring. Under this goal, we have a number of objectives, with the first being related to the effect of water quality on the species. As you can see here, we have 3 actions under this objective, with action 4.1.1 being to continue the lake water quality monitoring that is currently being conducted. There are a number of water quality monitoring efforts being conducted right now, including monitoring by the local tribes, UC Davis, and Lake County, just to name a few. Action 4.1.2 is to review the available literature and initiate tributary water quality monitoring to assess whether water quality in the tributary streams is having a negative impact on the Hitch, and if so, to what extent. The last action is to compare water quality data to the population monitoring data to identify what specific water quality perimeters are having the largest negative impact on the Hitch. The next objective under Goal 4 is to study the effects of predation and competition from non-native fish species on the Hitch. So this is often cited as a primary threat to the species, but there's not a lot of data out there. We do know that 20 non-native fish species have been introduced and have become established in Clear Lake. This includes largemouth bass and catfish, which can prey on adults and juveniles, and Mississippi silversides, which prey on larvae. In addition, smaller largemouth bass, redfin shad, and silversides also feed on the same food resources as juvenile and adult Hitch, so they're competing with them for those food resources. Again, we know that these non-native fish species are having an impact on the Hitch. We just don't know to what extent. So the 2 actions we have under Objective 4.2 is to determine the food web structure in Clear Lake and to develop a model to assess the impact predation and competition are currently having on the Hitch. The next objective under this goal is to determine the effects from water extraction. Water extraction is often cited as one of the primary threats to the species, but again, we don't have a lot of data. The one action under this goal is to develop a model or use the modeling currently being completed for compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, to determine the effect of water extraction during the spawning period. The last objective under this goal is to implement other research. There's currently 3 actions under this objective, and they include identifying Clear Lake's undisturbed shoreline, researching the effectiveness and legality of using drones for monitoring and habitat assessments, and to determine the benefits and feasibility of carp removal in Clear Lake. We believe if a large portion of the carp population could be removed from Clear Lake, we may see improvements in lake water quality and also Hitch abundance. So our last goal, Goal 5, is to increase outreach and education programs. The first objective under this goal is to expand educational efforts to increase public awareness. Action 5.1.1 is to develop or expand outreach to local schools such as helping to support field trips to observe spawning runs. Action 5.1.2 is to develop best management practices that the public can implement to improve the condition of the watershed. And the last action is to ensure we are coordinating with the appropriate groups, such as Lake County Public Works and the Board of Supervisors. So our last objective is to increase public engagement. And to accomplish this, we set 3 actions to organize volunteer events, to clean up and restore local creeks, to coordinate with other agencies or entities to increase the number of outreach opportunities we're involved in, and finally, to create an online presence so that the public can track our efforts and can access the latest information on the hitch. So we have had a couple of reoccurring, I'm going to call them speed bumps through the development of the strategy, and they're likely to come up again because they all deal with uncertainty or the data gaps that Fred had mentioned before. When we do come across these situations, we make sure to discuss them as a team. We make sure everybody gets heard on their opinion, and we set a path forward while recognizing that as we get more data from the actions that we set in the strategy, it's likely the strategy will need to be modified. So we call out in the strategy that it is adaptive. Some other kind of little road bumps that we've gone through is different opinions on what the primary issue is that's impacting the species. You know, we all recognize that the threats to the watershed are having negative effects to the hitch, but we just don't know to what extent. And since we don't have the data to identify what the primary threats are, we make sure to include those as research needs as in our actions. Like Fred went over earlier, we currently know there's a major concern with a lack of recruitment, but we just don't know what is causing it. Another little road bump was difficulties in setting a population target since we don't have historical or current population estimates. And so, you know, we set boundaries on our target, and we really call out again that number is probably going to change as we learn more information and that the whole strategy is adaptive. Another little road bump is climate change, you know, how to incorporate kind of the unknown of what's going to happen in the future. And again, I think that recognizing that this strategy is adaptive and that as we learn more information, it's going to be updated regularly. So one thing that I've definitely learned from developing the strategy is that it's going to take time to get right. We're learning information as we're going along. And so not to rush it, and we'll finish it when we finish it. So as I mentioned, the strategy is still in development. It's still draft. I just recently received some additional suggestions for actions, so we'll need to discuss those as a group. And our next meeting is currently scheduled for February 2nd, so we'll discuss them then. And we're targeting spring or so to finalize the strategy, but again, we're not going to rush it, so if it takes longer, it's going to take longer. And I think that's all I had. Here's my email address if anybody wants to contact me after tonight if we don't have enough time for questions, but I can take questions now.
Thank you so much, Amber, for that. That was great. So much great information. You did a great job going through the strategy and pinpointing all the actions and looking at it after attending those meetings and being so ingrained in the detail, the minutia, to see it all outlined with the actions. It's really, it's great to see all that. And as somebody who works in an agency, it's great to have an outline. This is what we can aim for, and here's why, and here's the plan that says it. And it makes getting funding and making those action items easier to attain really a lot easier. So it's great to have that. Thanks for all your hard work. We do have some questions. I'm going to switch your slide here.
Okay.
Yes.
I can stop sharing mine. There we go.
Oops. And actually, so we're going to have questions right now for both of the panelists, but I do have a question that is related to your talk, Amber, from before, because we talked on one of the action items about the streams, barriers and monitoring, and Betsy asked if there's any way to protect parts of the streams that are specific habitat for spawning adults. And this can include things like preventing disruption by human activity, ensuring presence of water necessary to protect them. So if there's any of that information that you can provide for that answer.
I really think that would be part probably of those best management practices that we would come up with, or even that restoration guidance. I don't know about like actual protections, putting an easement, because I think a lot of these streams are also private land, and so that, you know, would be working with a private landowner. But, you know, there is ways that we can restore the habitat, make sure that it is in the best condition it can be, so when we do have available water, that the species is able to reproduce there and have the best chance of having successful reproduction.
Great. And then we had a follow-up question for that, or a question also from Betsy that Fred answered in the chat, but she was exciting to see the barriers identified, so that map that had where the barriers were, and wondering if there's a way to kind of like categorize them, or so give some specifics with those type of barriers. And I can't remember if that was something we were going to already have in the strategy or wanted to put in the strategy.
We do have something like that at the very end. It's an appendix that we have kind of a more detailed of what each barrier is by stream, is what I believe how we did it. And so we do have a little bit more detail in the strategy. And we kind of included all barriers. So I want to say there's some areas like where there's overgrown blackberry shrubs and stuff that are going into the creek. And so we even identified those. And that would be an easy kind of action to go out there and kind of clear up those shrubs and allow the fish to get by them. But then we also include, you know, major barriers like some of the bridge, the footings on the bridges that are causing issues, or, you know, low crossing channels, things like that. Pretty much anything that would prevent hitch from making their way up the stream under any flow condition, low flow or even high flow.
Great. And then Lori asked a question, if you're seeing spawning in creeks other than Kelsey and Adobe. And Fred, you can answer that because your answer just showed up in the chat. Other attendees can't see the questions. And then I'll also say that County of Lake, we participate with the Chi Council, and also with Clear Lake Environmental Research Center also has a Chi Hitch monitoring program with them, as well as Chi Council. And we've seen a lot of hitch in Middle Creek, and are actually starting a pit tagging program where we'll set up and we're going to target Middle Creek first to see how fish are using that tributary.
Yeah. So Angela, on my chat, it says that I'm sending my answers to everyone.
So everyone can see your answer, but not everyone can see the question that she asked.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. All right. So I think we're good there then, because you just explained. Okay.
So was there any, your answer was that most creeks have sustained flow in the spring and they can support spawning. Lori asked if we're actually observing that spawning in those creeks besides Kelsey and Adobe.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. When pretty much any creek that does have sustained flow in the springtime is going to be able to support some spawning. And so if you look hard enough at the right times, the fish are often there. They can be hard to find sometimes. And there are a few key streams that seem to support most of the spawning. There's Kelsey, Adobe, Middle's one of them, Cole and Siegler. So, you know, it really depends on the conditions in the creek, on the extent to which they'll be used for spawning.
And we have seen too, sorry, Fred, we have seen too where there is successful spawning, but then the tributary creeks might dry out before the eggs are able to develop, or the young's able to make it back in, or the young's able to make it into the lake. So even though the reproduction might be successful, we're not seeing that recruitment still.
Yeah, and I just had a video up and I was trying to get it back. This image here we actually took last year in Middle Creek. So there's some water, and this hitch had just finished spawning, and I don't know, maybe they sit on their eggs or taking a break. It was taking a little breather or something. But this water, you know, within very shortly got lower and drier. So they're like to spawn in these very shallow, lots of flow, oxygenated, very, you know, lots of veg and probably lots of critters in there to eat, but very shallow, could get warm really fast. Yeah. So those are the kind of conditions.
Circling back to that question about what water depth do the fish like to use, you know, as this video shows, you know, surprising how shallow of a water system they'll use for spawning. You can, see them with their backs out of the water while they're trying to spawn. So it's pretty fun and pretty interesting to watch them and their behavior in the streams when conditions are suitable for actually seeing them.
Great. So we have a couple more questions. Sarah's asking, what extent do you think climate change, current climate change conditions and future impacts have been covered in the conservation strategy? And then where else can it get stronger? Where can that case for climate change impacts be stronger?
It's a really good question. And actually, I was asking myself that when I was practicing this presentation earlier today. And I think, maybe we can even start thinking of an additional goal, maybe of adding into the strategy of how we can address some of the impacts of climate change. It's hard with the species, I feel, because there is a lot of data gaps. And so with those data gaps, also trying to incorporate in something that we don't have complete certainty with is hard. But again, because it's adaptable, I think that we can bake something into the strategy that shows that as we learn more information, it can be modified more. So that was a really good question, Sarah, and I definitely have been thinking about it today.
All right, and then you have another question. If the current draft of the strategy is available for the public at all, and if there's a link to that, or where would somebody find that? And if it's something that you need to borrow the Water Resources website and we can get that on there at some point, know that you have that available, Amber, unless it's somewhere else.
No, we actually don't have it posted anywhere. I know that there has been a lot of agency involvement, and I'm not sure if their upper management has been able to review stuff, so it probably would have to at least go through that initial review. I would be fine, though, with putting a draft up there on your website, Angela, if you guys were fine with that after kind of all of our agencies had that initial review and we're fine with the statements we make. And I don't think there's anything too shocking in there. So I think it could be fairly quickly.
Okay, yeah. So Lori, you asked that. Pay attention to the Water Resources, and maybe we'll do a link on our Facebook or a follow-up to this. So, in the comments, or we'll make a notice so people can check it out. Particularly as this is going to be recorded and available. So if people want a little more detail after this, that's a good idea. So Amber and I will work on that. And then, while you guys were talking about climate change, I got a video that I had at the beginning of the talk that actually has some hitch spawning in that same creek that we saw. So one of these fish is the one that was taking a little breather in the last video. So you can see how shallow it is and how they flop around. So, and that's Middle Creek, I believe, there that our staff took. So we have a question from Mark is about osprey predation. So I guess the question is, how is the impact of osprey predation on hitch, especially like this? I mean, what looks more tastier to osprey and easy pickings? And then also the primrose, so the invasive primrose choking out the tules over the last 30 years. And if you guys want to answer the first one, you can touch on the second part of that question, but I can also follow up with that since that's my job to manage the primrose in the lake.
Well, I can touch on the predation piece real quick. So the issue with predation is a really complicated one, actually, because we know through observations that there's a lot of critters out there that will eat the hitch, right? There's not only osprey, there's piscivorous fishes in the lake, as Amber mentioned, and a variety of other things too. And so we know that they're consumed by these organisms and these animals, but trying to elucidate whether or not that actually has a meaningful effect on the population is something that's really difficult to tease apart, especially with the limited amount of information that we have. And so I think, if I was to say whether or not ospreys have a meaningful effect on hitch population, I would say most likely not. They've been around together for a really long time, and they're pretty common components of the ecosystem. So that's the simplest answer I can give.
You agree, Amber? Anything?
I agree. We don't address osprey predation in the strategy, and I think Fred answered that pretty well, because they, you know, they have evolved together, and it doesn't seem to be really a significant issue, especially compared to, you know, the 20 introduced fish that we have in the lake.
And the second part of Mark's question was the primrose choking out the massive amount of acres of tules. And yes, that is an issue. And when we are starting, we want to be able to get rid of that invasive primrose. It creeps along the water. It starts from the shoreline and creeps out. You guys probably see it out in the lake. It's really bright green. It gets these bright yellow flowers, and it is just it chokes all the channels, the shorelines. It's used by some wildlife, some birds, but it gets so thick, both on the surface of the water, it kind of shades out everything underneath it. And it'll slowly take over a patch of tules and reduce the growth and spread of tules. So it is something that the county is starting to work on. We don't want to spray a bunch of herbicide everywhere. We don't know the impact of that. You know, we want to be able to do some manual removal, but that also has some impacts. Walking around pulling stuff, you could pull baby hitch or other fish. So we're starting a management strategy, and we want to be careful. We want to make sure it aligns with the hitch conservation strategy. But also we get out primrose before it takes over the whole darn lake. So we do have one more minute. And somebody asked about, they saw Adobe Creek running last year for about 2 days before it dried, probably in the section they were observing, and is wondering if that is enough time for hitch to spawn. So it's not necessarily the how much time does the spawning process take? So spawning and the eggs to hatch and for the fish to be able to swim back to the lake, right? So do we have an idea on that timing?
Yeah, so 2 days is not enough time. As Angela was saying there, it's a whole process, right? So there's the time needed for the fish to actually migrate up into the streams. They'll typically hold for a while until they're ready to actually spawn. And then when they spawn, it's time for those eggs to develop and to hatch, and for those offspring to then work their way out of the streams. And so that's a much longer process than just 2 days. So if you see fish in the stream, I mean, they can certainly, you know, spawn within 2 days. But if the creek goes dry after 2 days from when the fish have spawned, then it's more likely than not that those eggs are probably going to be exposed to air and not survive.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Yeah, and a drought year like we just had and may have again definitely has high impacts on that. So I have one last question, and then we'll be good and we'll finish up. I know we're over a little bit, but asking if we monitor the stream flows, how long flows will last, temperatures, so then we can actually gauge and be able to support spawning year to year and see those changes and the impact to the hitch spawning. And Amber, I don't know if you want to talk about that, because that is an action item in the conservation strategy, right?
Yeah. Not all of the streams are being monitored. There are some flow stations in some of the streams, some of the primary streams. Fred, you probably know better than I do what exactly streams do have them, but not all of them do. And actually, it's only a few that do. Fred, which ones have?
Yeah, so both USGS and the California Department of Water Resources have, and UC Davis now have some gauges throughout the watershed. So there's USGS and DWR gauges on Kelsey Creek, both down near the lake and also up in the mountains in the watershed. There's also some gauges on Cole and also Middle Creek. So the two longest time series are in Middle and in Kelsey. And we also have some temperature information as well. So we have some pretty good information on those creeks in particular. And the general kind of pattern, seasonally at least, is that there's a pretty high correlation in the timing of flows and the magnitude of flows across these creeks. We've been able to tell that by looking at the data, both with flows and patterns in temperature as well. And so while we don't have gauges on all of the creeks, we do have a good sense as to when they're flowing and how much, because we can kind of index that by some of the other gauges that are out there.
We definitely like to get some more water quality information too on those creeks. Yeah. And so that's why we do have that as an action, because we do have some flow information and temperature, but we'd like some more.
Yeah, it's a critical habitat that supports, the spawning and reproduction of this fish. And so it's the more information we can have on this habitat is the more we have, the better, really, to be able to conserve this fish.
Yeah, and I will mention that Big Valley has a bunch of stream gauges right now for flow. I think temperature too in the Adobe and Kelsey Creek area, and they're adding more. So really supportive, collaborative effort here, multi-agency. Lake County's working with USGS and the Blue Ribbon Committee to get a couple other gauges out there in Clover Creek and Molesworth Creek and Coal Creek. So we're really trying to expand the monitoring network because it's important for all the questions that you guys had in here and for the future conservation of the species. So thank you guys so much for coming today and speaking on a Wednesday night. I appreciate it. And to everybody out there, I did put a link in the chat for the survey so we know how we're doing, so we can keep doing these Water Quality Wednesdays if they're useful. Access to scientific information that's current, relevant, that you need to know about Clear Lake and other water sources here in the county. And thank you so much to our speakers, Amber Aguilera, Fish Wildlife Service, Fred Feyrer. I totally pronounced your name wrong earlier. I apologize. So thank you. Thank you to all of those that attended. Thanks to Sam and Jake, our IT and techs, for putting this on tonight and staying until 7 o'clock also to help us with that. And thank you so much. We're going to end the webinar now. Amber and Fred, thank you. Do you have any last final words?
Nope, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you guys so much, and have a good night to everybody.
Take care.